Hi, everybody. So I promised I would do more videos and more images and things like that. So I want to go through a PowerPoint on World War I, or the Great War. And I know that I talked about it um, in the earlier class, earlier lecture, and went over this World War I combatants for you, just to let you have another little visual of it. I had written it on the board, but wanted to show it to you there as well. So just to rehash, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Serbia is allied with Russia. Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declares war on Russia. Russia and France are allied, and France hates Germany, so France declares war on Germany. And then Britain declares war on Germany when Germany goes through Belgium. So we'll look at this. Right? So here's a map of all of that. And you can see these different countries here. And here's my cursor. So here's Serbia. Remember in that earlier video, I talked about how small Serbia was. Here's Austria-Hungary, where Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne. Serbian nationalists from here assassinated him, and Austria-Hungary said, Serbia, we're just going to invade you and take you out, and we'll be fine. And then Serbia was allied with Russia, which included the Ukraine, which included Poland, right? This was all part of the Russian Empire here at the time. So this was a big deal. You have in here the pink powers or the Central Powers. This is Turkey on this map. This was the Ottoman Empire, which has is collapsing in this era. And then you can see the other allies. You can see in the green here, we've got a lot of neutral countries, Norway and Sweden, Denmark, Spain, of course, Switzerland here. Even the Netherlands is neutral in 1914. I do want to point out that Finland up here is controlled by Russia at the point, and that will be a big conflict as well in this period, right? So the world goes to war, and how does President Wilson and the United States respond? Now, I know that I'm breaking the first cardinal rule of PowerPoint slides by having this. You can look up this whole speech. I just wanted you to have it. I don't know if you care, you could screenshot it or whatever. But there's 2 points in here that I wanted to point out. Right up here, he talks about the spirit of neutrality, right? He wants the United States to stay neutral. The Americans need to stay neutral, and in their actions, but also in their thoughts, in the spirit of impartiality, the spirit of fairness and friendliness to all concerned, the spirit of the nation, right? So it's not just enough to be neutral in action, but we also have to be neutral in thought. Now, we'll hear that again in World War II in 1939, when Franklin Roosevelt will say this a little differently. But in 1914, Woodrow Wilson, the president, says we need to be neutral in action and in action and in thought. And then he says, the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. Right? So this is another point I wanted to bring out. Part of the reason that the United States wanted to stay neutral at this time was because of our population. So this is just a chart, and the term melting pot is problematic for sure. But this is the phrase that was used at the time, this idea of a melting pot, everybody coming together. Today, a lot of people think of it as, you know, stew or goulash, where you can see the distinct meat and potatoes and carrots and onions, but they're all in the same sauce together and a part of a greater whole. But this melting pot phrase was what was common at the time. So this is America in 1914. And I want you to look at first over here at this foreign-born population by country of birth. Remember, we've talked about the number of immigrants coming into the United States in this time period. Coming up to here, it's going to take a nosedive after this because of different immigration restrictions. But in this time period, you have all these people that are immigrants to the United States, born in these other countries. You've got over 800,000 from England, 250,000 from Scotland, over 1 million from Ireland. in the up to this point. 1.6, almost 1.7 million from Germany, over 5 million from Austria, almost 400,000 from Hungary, 1.4 million from Russia, 1.6 million from Italy. These are those new immigrants that your textbook talks about, right? So look at this, and then think back to our chart with the different players in this conflict, right? You've got the Central Powers here, and Italy again flips sides. Then you've got the Triple Entente, England and the UK really, and Russia. And then add to that, and all those numbers of foreign-born population, add to this the native-born population of foreign or mixed parentage, meaning one or both of their parents are immigrants to the United States. So this is the children of these people. So these are first generation of Americans, people who were born in the United States, but their parents are immigrants. And then add these numbers up, right? Look at these millions of people that have this very close connection to these foreign countries, right? To these places that are all now involved in the war. 1.8 million from England and Wales, 500,000 from Scotland, 3 million from Ireland, 5 million from Germany, 1 million from Austria, right? And the numbers just keep going on. So this is something that Woodrow Wilson was worried about, and something that he was talking about when he says the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from nations now at war. It's because we had so many immigrants and so many children of immigrants from these European countries that were now at war. So he really was very aware of this and wanted to find a way to, not show favoritism to any of those European powers. But in reality, we do end up wanting to avoid what's going on here in Europe. We want to avoid this conflict. So this is an incredibly brutal war. I talked some in the earlier video about this being a total war. And with a total war, the goal is total destruction. You put everything in to destroying the enemy. You have the new technology. We talked about barbed wire. You can see here in this image the barbed wire and the way it's used to slow down the path of others. But you also have this new idea, kind of not a new idea, but used in a new tactical way of trenches and trench warfare. And this is a trench, right? It's just basically a big ditch. Some are wide and have a lot of structure built in. Some are narrow. You can see this bottom picture how narrow this is, where the men are just escaping the fire. And if you look at this image here, this diagram here, you can see the way this war goes. You've got the German lines and the German trench, right? So this is going to be a trench or a ditch with the barbed wire. And you've got this no man's land that really belongs to nobody. And then the British lines, where it's the British trench and the British barbed wire. And you can see a second line here, a defensive line, in case they have to withdraw from that one, they can go to the second one. This is all done near French villages. Much of the fighting of this conflict is going to be in France. So basically what happens is the men live in these trenches and fire upon one another. They bombard each other. And then once the bombarding stops, they climb out, which is what's happening in this image, right? They climb out of their trenches through their own barbed wire and then charge across this no man's land with their rifles, which all have bayonets on the end, because if you make it across this field where the men on the other side are in the trench looking over the top, firing at you, often with machine guns, if you survive that, then you have to jump into the enemy's ditch and fight hand-to-hand combat quite often, using your bayonet or other knives to try to kill the enemy hand-to-hand. It's just a brutal war, and very quickly you have battles where 300,000 men from each side are killed. It's just incredibly brutal. And think about the realities of this. What happens to this ditch? if this trench, if it rains, what happens to it? It fills with mud. You can't get out of it because the enemy is firing upon you. So you have to stay there in the mud. And if you've heard of trench foot, right? Think of what trench foot is basically the men's feet would rot. You know, if you get out in the rain or get caught somewhere in your shoes and socks and your feet get wet, by the time you get home and you take your shoes and socks off, your feet are all wrinkled and nasty and hurt. Now imagine standing in that wet for days and weeks at a time, and in the cold, and in, with rats and, feces, and just miserable experience for these people, for these young men. And the Americans saw this and wanted to stay out. So we have this political conflict and reality in that, we've got so many people in the United States who are going to support the different sides. And then we've got this reality that it's just miserable, horrible conflict that nobody can win. Literally millions of men die in this horrid trench warfare. It's just awful. But we do shift towards war. We do end up shifting towards war. And there are 5 reasons. So I'm going to go through each of these 5 reasons, and I'll try to be fairly quick. So we have 5 reasons. First, we have cultural ties to the Triple Entente. Remember, we're talking about England, we're talking about France, this tie to them, leaning towards them. The United States and Great Britain, although we, fought in the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812, from that time forward, we'd been pretty good allies. And then you've got France. Of course, France built and gave us the Statue of Liberty, right? It shipped over in pieces and got put back together. And we have this great connection to France as well. They had participated in our Civil War, and these long ties. So while we have many Americans, especially those German Americans, and even the Irish Americans, who, remember, the Irish were actively trying to find their independence, even though we have those connections, the ties to the Triple Entente are stronger. The second reason the United States drifts towards war is basic economics. And in reality, every war is somewhat about money. We've talked about recent conflicts over the last 25 years or so, and no blood for war, right? No blood for oil, no blood for oil, and we shouldn't fight for oil. And of course we're going to fight for oil. Of course we're going to fight for economic stability. And in reality, in World War I, we get more and more sucked into this with an economic reasoning. You can see the United States initially starts, and we're going to bring supplies to both sides, right? We'll sell anything to anybody. We'll sell to the Germans, we'll sell to the French, we'll sell to the British. We don't care. Buy our stuff. Right? It's very good sometimes to be the neutral party that can make money off of everybody. But the British have this great naval fleet, right? They're an island nation. They're an empire. They have one of the greatest navies in the world. And you can see that what they do here, this is the North Sea here, right? The Pacific, the Atlantic Ocean is out here. And the ships that would be delivering goods to Germany would come in through here, through the North Sea and down to Germany. Well, they blockade the North Sea, the British do, which means American ships can't get in to supply the Germans. Well, we're not very happy about it, but the British just buy more and the French just buy more. So that's okay. The reality is that the British and the French can't afford to pay cash for all of their goods because they're at war. So we end up loaning them a lot of money. We end up selling them a lot of goods on credit, and we end up loaning them millions of dollars to help in their fight. Now, if you loan enough money and you give enough credit, that means that you become more and more dependent upon their success. Because if the British and French had lost this war, what would happen to the money that they owed to the United States? They wouldn't be able to pay it, right? So the more economically tied to the British and French victory we become, the closer and closer we get dragged into war, because we become more dependent on them winning so we can get paid back for those loans. So this is a huge and very important factor. Propaganda is a third point. The British are going to be sending a lot of great propaganda to the United States, talking about victims and the brutality of the Germans, killing women from hospital ships and sinking them. You can see this is a woman with a Red Cross, so she's a nurse or with the Red Cross, and she's obviously dead, right, from her very paleness. And we have to stop them. This is another type of propaganda, this idea of making the enemy an animal, right? So this is a beast. We know he's German because of the hat, right? It says militarism across the top, right? And you see what's going on here? So this is Europe over here. Across the ocean, because many Americans, rightly in this time period, said the United States was safe. We have those two oceans on either side to protect us, so we don't need to worry about them. And the argument of this poster is, look, the Germans are going to destroy Europe, and then they're going to cross the ocean and take us. Now, this symbol of American womanhood, right? This is liberty. Or Columbia, both names are used for her, white woman who is obviously being ravaged by the brutal German beast. You can see his, it says culture on there with a K, right? And he's beating people with it. You can see the blood all over his hands, the drool coming from his mouth. He's obviously been brutalizing people and will ravish the woman. So this type of image of, womanhood, especially white womanhood, being killed by these evil Germans, we need to protect them and get them where they are before they come and get us where we are. And so the British are using this type of propaganda. And then once we do get in the war, more and more of that comes from the Americans themselves. Now, the biggest reason really that we get involved in this, and remember there's 5 reasons I'll be talking about. The biggest reason is Germany itself. Now, the Lusitania is the most famous reason, and one of my missions as a teacher is to make sure that you understand it's not the Lusitania. The Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915. It was a horrific thing. There's actually a very good book by Eric Larson called Dead Wake on the sinking of the Lusitania. It's very well written from both the German perspective and the perspective of those on the ship. It's written so well that at one point I was rooting for the submarine captain, and then I realized what I was rooting for. It's awful. It's so good. But the Lusitania is an ocean liner. It is sunk. Something like 1,100 people are killed just off the shore of Ireland when it is sunk. 128 of those who were killed were Americans. It is sunk by a German submarine, and really this is the biggest tool that the Germans have. They have these incredible submarines, U-boats. The German word is underwater boat, so they're called U-boats. These German U-boats are incredible, and they're wreaking havoc in the Atlantic. Remember, we said that the United States was supplying the Allies with goods to support their war effort. Well, the Germans started sinking them and sinking British ships as well. The Lusitania is very controversial because it's a civilian ship. This is actually a sister ship to the Titanic. It didn't go very well for either one of those, did it? But this is part of it, right? The Germans are sinking ships like the Lusitania and merchant ships as well, all over the Atlantic and in the Celtic and Irish seas. This is 1915. The United States doesn't get involved until 1917. So please don't say we got involved because of the Lusitania. It was controversial. It was a big deal, but we didn't go to war. And again, I just like this poster about the U-boats as well, right? So the Germans had the propaganda or the U-boats and sinking the Lusitania and all these things, but they just, everything kept building more and more and more. Germany, after the Lusitania had said, President Wilson sent them a note and said, hey, knock it off or we're going to war. And the Germans didn't want the United States in the war. They knew that we would have enough stuff to push it over the edge, our goods that we would bring with us. So they ended their unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant they were sinking whoever they wanted to. Well, after Wilson's letter, they said, okay, we won't anymore. Then in 1917, January of 1917, a year and a half after this was sunk, a year and a half after they had agreed to not sink these ships in unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans announced that they would be returning to that unrestricted submarine warfare. They would sink anybody that wasn't flying a German flag or ally of Germany flag. So this got the Americans angry again. And then in late February of 1917, the British intercepted this telegram. This was known as the Zimmermann telegram, and it was from the German foreign minister to Mexico. And in this telegram, the German foreign minister Zimmermann told the Mexico that if they would declare war on the United States, that they would help the Germans, when they had won in Europe, would come to the United States and help restore Germany's lost territories. And if you think of it, this is what they're talking about, right? Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and then all the way up here into Colorado, California, Nevada, all of this. This was all once part of Mexico. These were most recent states that had most recently belonged to Mexico. And Zimmermann said, hey, we'll help you get this back. And you've got to remember, your textbook talks about this, that there had been a lot of conflict and tension, and there would continue to be over these years on the US-Mexico border. The United States had very boldly taken this territory from Mexico, and there was continuing conflict. Think of Pancho Villa and others like this. And again, your textbook talks about this quite extensively. So the tension was there. This was not a bad political idea to get Mexico to keep the United States busy. Because remember, much of the United States wanted to stay out of this conflict already. If that we were already, kind of not wanting to be a part of it, and then all of a sudden we're very distracted on the southern border, maybe we really would have stayed out of it. But the British intercepted the telegram and shared it with us in February of 1917, late February. Mexico didn't take action on this because they knew they'd been caught, and they weren't confident that Germany could defeat the rest of Europe in this time. And so it doesn't happen. Germany in late February and March of 1917 starts torpedoing American ships. And so finally, after much deliberation, on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson goes before Congress and asks for a declaration of war against Germany and her allies. All right. I like this political cartoon. Remember, the power of political cartoons is so good. And it's got the Senate and the House, and they're reporting for duty to Uncle Sam. You can see here, American rights are violated, ships are sunk without warning, Americans killed, that kind of thing. And the decree is signed, war is declared. It is not unanimous, 373 to 50. So it is still controversial, even in 1917. People weren't quite sure they wanted to do it, but now we were in it for sure. Okay. And now the fifth reason. Remember, I said five. You'd think I would have ended there with that. But the fifth reason is ego, right? And by ego, I mean that sense of ego, right? So Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States. He was pretty arrogant man. He was actually a historian, had a history major, so you can do anything with a history degree, just saying. But he had been president of Princeton and done all sorts of academic things. And he really, really believed that he could do it. He really believed that he could make a difference in writing the peace of Europe. You note I've included this Inauguration Day banner because you'll note it's March 7th, 1917. So he declares war just a month or so after he'd been inaugurated for his second term. He had campaigned in his election on the platform of he kept us out of war. Right, that was the motto of the Wilson campaign, was he kept us out of war. So you have millions of Americans who voted for him with the understanding that he was going to continue to keep us out of war. He gets inaugurated on March 17th, and a month later, the United States declares war on the Central Powers. I also include the ego of the nation, because the United States wanted to be a world power. We know that from our earlier discussions. And the reality is, this was the party, right? You couldn't be homecoming queen if you don't go to the homecoming dance, right? This is the same kind of thing. The United States could not be considered a world player, could not be considered a world leader if we weren't a part of the biggest event to happen in 100 years. This was the event. This was the homecoming dance, and you know, Wilson and the United States, they wanted to be homecoming queen or king. And Wilson, again, he really thought he was the only person who could write the peace. So the United States goes to war in April of 1917, and 1917 is just a truly horrific year for the Allies. This is a photo of Verdun on the left there. This is a French village, completely decimated. Hundreds of thousands of men are killed on both sides. The one on the right is of the Chateau Woods, and you can see it's kind of a duck board. They build that little walking trail to go through the woods. You see all the water. It's one of the horrific natures of this is the water table in much of France is very high. So as these spaces are bombarded, the water comes to the surface. So you've got these big ditches filled with water and ponds filled with water. Very unpredictable, very difficult to move from place to place. You can see this whole forest just completely wiped out. You've got the French military on the edge of mutiny. The British are running out of men to send to this war. It's just horrible. So the news in April of 1917 that the United States is going to be a part of this conflict really rallies them enough to hang on until we can get there. Two, in Russia in the spring of 1917, the Russian Empire, the Russian family had been deposed by the Mensheviks, and the revolution in Russia and the real civil war in Russia doesn't start till that fall, but the revolution in Russia had begun. So much of the allies of that Triple Entente are on the verge of collapse. Germany was so close, and that was their great gamble. If the United States hadn't declared war, just for the psychology of it, it very easily might have gone the other way. They didn't get there soon enough to save Russia. So Russia, again, is in the middle. By 1918 is in a civil war. The Russian Empire is collapsing, and Russia finally surrenders to Germany. So this is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is a line where they draw, and you can see today Estonia, Lithuania, the Ukraine, modern nations today. The line is drawn here. It goes right through part of Poland, what becomes Poland as well. So Russia actually surrenders. Russia, who is allied with Great Britain and allied with France and allied with the United States, surrenders independently to Germany. So now Germany and Austria-Hungary are just turning west. They don't have to fight against Russia anymore. So this is a really very dangerous time. Right. You have all sorts of struggles here too. And this is going to aggravate the situation in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and in Turkey. There are serious food shortages. And I think that's something that people often forget when we think about war. You know, people think about soldiers and death by guns and fire and things like that. But we often forget about the death by starvation. Especially of the civilians. And this is a serious, serious problem. And you could see all these places. Again, France was on the edge of mutiny in part because of the food shortage, but Germany is in dire straits. Austria-Hungary, Italy, this whole region is in trouble, and Turkey is in serious trouble as well. So you've got to layer that food shortages on top of that reality of military struggles. Right. The United States does get there. Some of our soldiers finally get there in 1918. It takes us a while to actually get there. You've got some Native Americans that get there. You've got a group of African Americans that show up too. I like this picture because it shows men in gas masks, which of course weren't very good, with one of the machine guns. And the American Doughboys is a very distinct hat that the Americans wore. But our men aren't there in very big numbers. It's really our stuff that matters. We're sending ships. We're sending, and this all starts in the spring of 1917. As soon as we declare war, we start sending supplies, medical supplies, ammunition guns, food and clothing, and we send them across to Europe and across to the Allies. And that's really our biggest help in World War I is the stuff that we send, because we're not at war. You know, we haven't been at war, and our manufacturing is able to make a big difference, right? You can see this is a key, right? The ships are the key to victory. So this is really an important part of the American story. In the United States, we had all sorts of conflict again. Remember, we've got a lot of people who were immigrants and who were German immigrants. We're worried about spies. In 1917, the Espionage Act is passed, which makes it illegal to spy, which seems fairly obvious. And then we've got other issues as well. So remember, the Irish hate the British, right? Ireland wanted to be free. You have in 1917 a great Irish rebellion called the Easter Rebellion. If you want to look that up, it's very interesting. So many Irish leaders would rather Germany survive than England, because if England fails, then maybe Ireland can be free. Then you have a lot of Germans with the language being eliminated or considered illegal. See, it says Hun language, which is the same kind of derogatory terms that they used in some of those propaganda posters. So you've got those millions of German immigrants that are filling American cities, and now all of a sudden their language is the language of the enemy. And this is another piece of propaganda from the idea of Woodrow Wilson's perspective, where he talked about the hyphenates, you know, the German Americans, the Irish Americans, the, you know, Czech Americans, Italian Americans. Get rid of those hyphens. You're just an American. And this effort to end that until we're just Americans. And then the second piece that comes out, and these are great violations of civil liberties in the United States, is the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to speak out against the American government, the American military, or any of our allies. So this article, he could have been charged under the Sedition Act. They arrested a director of a play about the American Revolutionary War under the Sedition Act. Why? because the enemy in the American Revolution is England, and England is our ally in World War I, and you can't say anything bad against them. So this is the point that it turns into, and neighbors calling on neighbors and getting them arrested for speaking German or anything like that. So it's really a very ugly time in American history. Woodrow Wilson lays out his plan for peace in January 1918, the 14 points. Again, I'm not going to go into all of them, but these are going to shape the treaty efforts later on, and you can see there's different peace, cartoons and things like that, and the basic ideas of his 14 points. The armistice is signed to silence the guns of war in November of 1918, and you may note that our Veterans Day today is on November 11th every year. It initially was a holiday known as Remembrance Day, and that was to remember the men who'd been lost in World War I. And November 11th is a Remembrance Day around the world. Sometimes you see people wearing poppies, and that's part of that. Many Veterans Day events occur at 11 a.m., and that because that's when the guns stopped firing, at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So that's partly why we celebrate that. The peace negotiations went in Versailles in France. They went from January to June of 1919. Woodrow Wilson left the United States and went and negotiated this. He went by ship and negotiated this for many years, or many months. The treaty is finally signed in June of 1919 by the Germans. It was brutal to the Germans. It demanded reparations. It demanded that they sign a war guilt clause, which said that it was all their fault, which you know from that earlier part of both this slideshow and the previous lecture, that it wasn't the Germans' fault. They didn't start it. They were just a part of it, just like anyone else. But it blamed the Germans and said they must pay for all the damage they had done, not just the damage to the cities, but the bullets, the cost of the war, the cost of the bullets that killed their own men. It creates great bitterness in the German people, which we'll talk about as we lead into World War II. Right. The reality is that the United States never signs this, even though Woodrow Wilson encouraged it, because the big part of this was the League of Nations, which is really a precursor to today's United Nations. This idea of have countries come together to talk rather than fight. The United States didn't want to get involved in it. Wilson had lost the Senate and the support of the American people, and we never sign it until a couple of years later. The United States signs a basic peace treaty with the Central Powers. So the United States never signs the Treaty of Versailles and never joins the League of Nations, which is often pointed to as a huge failure on our part when it comes to leadership, and one of the aggravating factors that led to World War II. I want to show you the new map that occurs after World War II, these lines that are drawn. You can see Finland becomes independent, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland gains new borders. Germany is much smaller. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is done. We have Czechoslovakia, we have Austria, Hungary, we have Yugoslavia, where little Serbia and was in here. Turkey is broken up into different countries, Syria and Lebanon, and Iraq, which is controlled by the British, and Lebanon by the French. This Alsace-Lorraine area of France, this region kept going back and forth to the Germans and the French, and the Germans and the French, and now after World War I, the French get it. We'll see what happens leading up to World War II. But a dramatically different map with a lot of different state lines. Former empires are just gone. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was down here. And now you note the name change here to the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks, the communist minority in the Soviet Union, had defeated the democratic government of the Soviet Union, of Russia, that had defeated the Tsar. and created the first major communist nation in the world of the Soviet Union. So this is going to lead to conflict for decades to come. Right? The reality, and something I want to leave you with, is the war destroys old Europe. It's lost forever. You have nearly 9 million military dead. You have many more than that when you count civilians, and 37 million casualties. And casualties are injuries. And I want to make sure you understand what this means. And I apologize for the how difficult this photograph is. But this is a young man and whose face has been destroyed, but he has survived. And there was a woman who built masks for these men so that they could have a somewhat normal looking face and exist in society. There's actually a whole series of photographs. This is really, World War I leads to the creation of modern plastic surgery because of so much of the devastation. So this is just, old Europe is destroyed, not just the lines of the page, but the reality of the lives of the people. I wanted to show you this final picture. This is the Tower of London and the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the war in 2014. They made these ceramic poppies and had them flow out of the Tower of London. It surrounds the whole thing to represent over 847,000 British dead. Just really powerful and moving footage. You can look online and find more pictures of it. Just really, very powerful when you think that every one of those poppies represents a life that was snuffed out far too young. And of course, the United States walks away, right? The League of Nations idea, the bridge here, and the United States sitting on the keystone and saying, nope, not gonna do it. Not gonna be a part of this, not gonna be a part of this conflict, because they can see that nothing has really been solved. Nothing has really changed in Europe. And as the war ends and as the Treaty of Versailles is signed, just about everybody involved realized that they were just buying time until the next conflict. And of course they were right. It would be 20 years later, by just a few weeks really, when the Second World War would begin. Okay. Let me know if you have questions. Always happy to talk about this. All right. Thank you.